and it sees patients via in-person and telemedicine care throughout both Virginia and North Carolina. And he's decided to grace our presence with himself today to share with us a very important lecture on diabetes. So at this time, I'm going to turn over the time to you, Ryan. Please, this is going to be a good time. Please listen to this good stuff.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and it's good to see you all today. Thank you for taking time out of your Saturday afternoon to come here for a health lecture, a community health lecture. I'm grateful to the Washington Seventh-day Adventist Church for hosting events like this so that we can raise awareness about healthy practices for living that are beneficial for us all. I know that this is something that within the Adventist Church we care a lot about health. It's a great passion of the church, and so we're glad to be able to present here today. Our topic is going to be about diabetes, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. This is a big topic. We're going to learn a lot together today. It'll be about 45 to 50 minutes. There's going to be different sections. We're going to talk about science. We're going to talk about health practices, some of the prevalence. And I imagine all of you are going to learn some things that you haven't, that perhaps you haven't known before. That appreciate the introductions. Aaron just went through most all of this. That's just a summary. My wife, Ruth, and I, we live in Jacksonville currently. We were living in Virginia Beach, now we live in Jacksonville, as my wife is an officer for one of the bases over there. So we're gonna dive into the presentation. I organize my talks always by sections. Here are the sections that we're going to be going through on our topic of diabetes, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. We're first going to talk a little bit about what is it? How do we define these things? How do we define them formally with lab work and testing? We're going to learn a little bit about why we should care about these, looking at the prevalence and the trends of how these conditions are progressing in our country and our world. We're going to learn a little bit about the conditions, how they present in the body, the symptoms and complications. We'll have a little time where we'll get a little technical for a few minutes with some of the mechanisms in the body, and then we're going to transition to the final portion will be the most applicable take-home portion, where we're going to be talking about practical steps that each one of you can do to limit the development or progression of these diseases. And then after that, we'll open it up for question and answer. So this is what we're going to do, and I hope you're all excited to learn today. So we're going to go into section 1 here, definitions and labs. How do we know what this is? How do we define diabetes, prediabetes? So diabetes mellitus, that's technically the second part of the word. Diabetes mellitus actually refers to a group of different diagnoses. It's not just one. There's type 1, there's type 2, there's gestational diabetes, different types. But this fundamental universal thing is all of them have to do with dysregulated blood sugar regulation. That's the common factor. They all involve dysregulated blood sugar factors. All types of diabetes result in too much sugar. One of the consequences is there's too much sugar going through the body, and that leads to symptoms. We're going to learn a lot about the symptoms, how this affects the body, but there's too much sugar. Type 1 is an autoimmune condition where, unfortunately, the body's kind of gotten confused and it's attacking the pancreas. Type 2 is the one we're going to speak about the most today. It's the most common form, and it's principally lifestyle and environment influence in our bodies. Gestation occurs when a lady is pregnant. We're mainly going to be talking about type 2. Now, what is pre-diabetes? You've all probably heard this term before, pre-diabetes. This pretty much means that this is a condition in which you have elevated blood sugar, but you don't quite yet meet the diagnostic criteria for full-blown diabetes. You're on your way, but the train hasn't arrived at the station yet, right? But you're going that direction. So we know that there's elevated blood sugar levels, there's impaired insulin control, but not enough to formally meet that threshold of diagnosis. We might think of it as the warning phase, and we see this through blood work. And so this is a time where we can try to turn that train around because we don't want to keep going in that direction. So this is certainly reversible. Now, what about insulin resistance? Oh, okay, I got it. So how do we diagnose these? Well, we diagnose these through blood work. And most of you have been to the doctor, I'm sure. You get blood work done. You get lab work testing done. And you probably get either hemoglobin A1C testing, fasting glucose testing, or oral glucose tolerance testing. And you're going to fall somewhere in these levels here, right? These levels are where we say, do you have good blood sugar control or impaired blood sugar control? So hemoglobin A1C, for example, 5.7 to 6.4, that means you have prediabetes. 6.5 or higher, that means you have diabetes. If you're under 5.7, generally in the 5s, 5.1, 5.2, that's good blood sugar control. And that marker there, hemoglobin A1C, that's an average of your last 3 months, average concentration of blood glucose on your red blood cells. So that's a pretty good marker. Fasting glucose, of course, you go to the doctor, you get a glucose test, you haven't eaten for 12 hours, check your straight blood sugar levels. If you're under 100, that's good, that's not a problem. If you're between 100 and 126, that's prediabetes, 127 and high, it's diabetes. You can also do oral glucose tolerance testing. This one isn't done as much, but it is done from time to time, and this is another way to diagnose it. So raise your hand if you've ever had any of these labs done by your doctor. Have you got a couple? Yeah, most of us here, I imagine, have had these tests done. All right, so some of you probably know where you fall in there, in these ranges. All right, now let's talk about insulin. You're going to hear the word insulin a lot today, because mechanistically, insulin is very important when we think about how we reverse diabetes. So to understand the lifestyle practices for reversing this or preventing it, we have to understand insulin. What is insulin? Well, insulin's a hormone. It's in fact a hormone that does a lot of different things. It is released by the pancreas when we eat food. And you can see some of the functions it does up here. It moves sugar into our cells, it moves amino acids into our cells. It pretty much, you can think of insulin as when you eat food, you produce insulin and it's going to say, take the nutrition from that food, store it into cells for future use. That's sort of a summary. Insulin has other functions, but it's really focusing on storing up energy. So one of the things that we're not doing when insulin is around, we're not burning fat, we're not burning our energy stores, we're actually building our energy stores when we have insulin levels high. And insulin, like I said, is secreted when we eat food, principally carbohydrates and proteins, that's when it's secreted. Okay, so that's a little bit about insulin. We're going to talk more about insulin. What is insulin resistance? Insulin resistance is when the cells that are supposed to respond to insulin stop responding as well as they used to do. So there's receptors on all of our cells, and most of our cells that take in sugar, that take in proteins, have receptors for insulin. But sometimes the cells are going to be a little bit pushy. They're going to push the insulin away. They're not going to take the insulin in as much. Insulin resistance is a condition when it becomes less effective. The insulin can't move the sugars and the proteins into the cells as well because the cells are becoming resistant. And that occurs for one of a couple reasons. It can occur most likely because, one, the cells themselves already have too much stored glucose in them. And there's only so much space. You can't keep forcing glucose into cells, so the cells are going to resist the insulin, trying to push it in more. Or the cells, they need to be resistant because there's damage to the receptors. The little receptors on the cells don't bind to insulin as well, so they're not getting the message. We don't often know when we have insulin resistance. This is silent. There's really not many symptoms associated with this. We'll talk a little bit about that, but many people don't know that they have this going on. But insulin resistance is the cellular phenomena that moves a person from good blood sugar control to prediabetes, to diabetes, to insulin-dependent diabetes. It's insulin resistance underneath all of that, making that worse. So that's why we're going to talk about it today and how to reverse it. Now, how do we diagnose this? We just looked at the labs for blood diabetes and prediabetes. Did you know you can also check insulin? Insulin is a really important lab to check. Every patient in our practice, we check insulin because insulin resistance is really common. You can get a fasting insulin level done. And if you're going to your doctor and getting fasting glucose and hemoglobin A1C, you want to get fasting insulins done. A good fasting insulin will be typically 5 to 8. That's a nice clean level. If you start getting higher than 10, 15, 20, that's often a sign you have insulin resistance. Now there's a little marker, the homeostatic insulin resistance score, that you can do. This is just a medical calculation that's done, where you take a fasting glucose, you take a fasting insulin, you put them in a little ratio, and if your number is greater than 2, really, 2 to 3, then you have insulin resistance. So this is a way that we can check this with blood work and track if this is occurring. There's also another more complicated ratio. That one's not done so much. The HOMO-IR score is done. So if you have concerns, or one of the takeaways, perhaps if you've been concerned about your blood sugar or this, and you have been going to the doctor getting labs done and you're not getting insulin labs, I encourage you, ask your doctor, start drawing fasting insulins on me, especially because you're going to learn a lot about it today. All right, so that's a little bit about the first section, definitions and labs. How do we define diabetes, prediabetes, insulin resistance, and the definitions of blood work? All right, that's section one. Now let's talk about why should we even be concerned about this? What's going on? Well, the prevalence of this, so in the United States, we've got ourselves around 337 million people in this country, give or take. 38.4 million people in the United States, around 11.6% of our population, meet diagnostic criteria for diabetes. And we just saw that is blood sugar above 127 or hemoglobin A1C above 6.5. So over 10%, 1 out of 10 people, just about 10%, a little above, have formal meet criteria for diabetes. All right, out of our population. Now what about prediabetes? We've got another 97.6 million people in the country that are in that warning phase, that are on their way to diabetes but don't quite yet meet diagnostic. That's a lot of people. When you put together 38.4 million plus 97.6 million, you get 136 million people in the US. That means about 40% of adults in the United States have either prediabetes or diabetes. 4 out of 10. That's a lot of folks. I mean, what do we have here? 30 people, maybe 40 people. I'm not sure. Just to do that, we got people right here. Anywhere you go, we're going to have a lot of Americans with this. Now that's from CDC statistics. This is a lot. 40% have prediabetes or diabetes. We're going to talk about today. What about the insulin resistance? All right, let's look at that. A 2021 study, University of Alabama, found that 40% of U.S. adults between 18 and 44 who don't meet criteria for diabetes now meet criteria for insulin resistance. Now we got another group. Now remember, insulin resistance starts occurring before we have prediabetes. We got prediabetes, then goes to diabetes, and insulin-dependent diabetes. So when you combine this, we're looking at somewhere between 50 to 60% of U.S. adults have one of these three. About half of the United States adult population have impaired blood sugar. That's a lot. Now, that we're going to learn about why that's the case, but that just shows you, like, this is a common thing. And if some of you have it, you're not alone, and you're going to learn a little about why that's been happening. All right, what about the world? Let's take a look at the whole world. The world population is about 8.2 billion. Okay, in the 10th edition of the International Diabetes Federation, this is some statistics that are done. What do we find? 537 million adults around the world. That's more than the whole population of the US plus another 200 million. 537 million adults around the world have diabetes, and about another 500 million more have impaired blood glucose, insulin resistance, or prediabetes, meaning that we've got about 1 billion people in the world with impaired blood sugar control. That is astounding, really. When you think about the different number of conditions that are out there, like, we're looking at a little bit over 1 out of 10 people on this planet have impaired blood sugar control. One of the things we talk about, insulin resistance, prediabetes, or diabetes. 7 million people die every year from complications of this. Health expenditures for this diagnosis alone is close to $1 trillion for this thing of the U.S. In our country. So this is a big deal. This is a big deal. This is a major condition that we have to know. This is really an epidemic. Now, has it always been this way? They're like, whoa, Ryan, this is some serious statistics here. Well, let's take a look at this. Going back to the 1980s, there were about 5.6 million people in the U.S. Now we have 38 million people in one generation that we've gone with diabetes. You can see the levels increasing here, really picking up in the 90s and the 2000s and taking off. And in every age group, in every ethnicity, male, female, you look at all of it, we see statistics in the U.S. raising. Now, China actually is having this even occur faster than us in the U.S. China is the country that's growing at a faster rate of these diabetic diagnoses. But the thing about it is also 90 to 95% of diabetes diagnoses are type 2, which is the lifestyle and environment influenced type of diabetes. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So anyway, it hasn't always been this way. So then why is this happening? What's going on? Why do we have this epidemic, really? Well, I think there's a lot of factors that have influenced this. Certainly, we know that there's a couple of big categories. We've had significant changes in nutrition, human nutrition, what we eat versus what human beings used to eat. Human beings are increasingly eating now ultra-processed foods, foods with added sugars, refined carbohydrates, highly processed, these things that did not used to be part of the diet of human beings now increasingly is part of our diet. We're consuming foods that have a lot of toxic additives in them, a lot of chemicals. We have caloric excess versus caloric balance. We have nutritional changes. That's a big piece of the pie, why this is happening. And we know that as Western countries export dietary habits around the world, we see Western diagnoses follow in those countries. We also see environmental changes. We live in a country where we're having increasing exposure to toxins, chemicals in our environment. From our household, from the air we breathe, the water we drink, the soils we grow our foods in, we're having higher levels of exposure to toxins, and we know many of these toxins have alter our blood sugar control. We also, across most of societies, have changes in lifestyle. Thinking about how human beings used to live, we used to have, jobs we used to do, more, that were more physical intensive, and now we're increasingly having less active lifestyles, we're increasingly having, office jobs, home jobs, less movement, increased stress, worse sleep. All these factors are lifestyle changes. And then we finally also have systemic changes that are occurring more in the systems. We see increases in hormone problems, GI problems. We see other systems that can interact with diabetes. So I would say when you look at the overlap of these three areas, these are major trends that affect most of us, which are really behind this elevation in diabetes diagnosis. All right, so that's number 2, section 2, talk about definitions and labs, talk about prevalence and trends. All right, well, kind of disturbing, right, to kind of see that, a little bit shocking, some of those statistics. Now we're going to learn a little bit more about the condition itself, and then get into the nuts and bolts of it, and then, of course, we'll eventually get to prevention steps. Symptoms and complications. All right, remember, all 4 types of diabetes, but the one we're talking about today is type 2, mainly have to do with too much sugar, okay? That's the common denominator. All types of diabetes, there's too much sugar in the body. So there's consequences of too much sugar in the body. And so eventually the sugar starts to spill out. So we start spilling it out in our urine, we start getting rid of it more. All symptoms of diabetes are the result of too much sugar throughout the systems. Now, if a person has uncontrolled advancing type 2 diabetes, you get these symptoms: increased urination, increased hunger, increased thirst and fatigue, and then potentially rapid weight loss, followed by an increase in appetite. That's if you have full-blown type 2 diabetes that's uncontrolled and it's not regulated. And some of you may or may not have experienced that in your life. That's really the result of sugar literally spilling out into your urine, and then it's causing those urges. Now, many people, at least here in the US, are medicated with type 2 diabetes or prediabetes, and so they're not experiencing these symptoms, so they have different symptoms, and we're going to look at that. So, but these are technically the diagnostic symptoms often that are used if someone doesn't know they have this. Hey doctor, I'm having all this occurred, increased hunger, thirst, urination. We look at that. There are complications that start to occur around the body with too much sugar. And we can group these into 2 categories: micro or macro vasculature. That's talking about blood vessels. We got our small blood vessels and our big blood vessels. So some of our symptoms are the result of too much sugar in the small blood vessels, microvasculature. That's going to be stuff like, well, if I have too much sugar going through my body all the time, I can start to damage the little tiny blood vessels in my eyes, retinopathy. And I can start to eventually get blindness if it goes uncontrolled from retinopathy. Or I might start damaging the little blood vessels in my kidneys, and I can start to get nephropathy, some kidney damage. And then a lot of people, diabetes is the main reason that in the United States people have to have dialysis. Or perhaps I might start getting damage in the little blood vessels around my nerves, and I start getting loss of sensory function, tingling, numbness, neuropathy. These are all microvascular complications, and in the US, diabetes is the leading cause of secondary complications: blindness, kidney disease requiring dialysis, and neuropathy. It's the main reason for it. It's the reason because too much sugar is damaging the little delicate blood vessels. One of the things I share here, there really isn't an organ system that isn't in some way affected by diabetes, because it causes damage to the blood vessels, and blood vessels go everywhere. So anywhere the blood vessel goes, there's potential for damage. Now, what about macrovasculature? These are the big blood vessels. If we have too much sugar going through those, then we can start to get macrovasculature complications, things like, well, I can start to get atherosclerosis. This is plaque in my arteries, right? We can have some narrowing in my arteries, some plaque start to fill in here, and that can thin them down. Heart disease, heart attacks, we're starting to impair blood flow. We know that a person who has type 2 diabetes is at a higher risk for having a heart attack because of the effects on the large blood vessels. And then also we know atherosclerosis through plaque formation can eventually lead to strokes, because you can have some of those break off and block vessels in our brain. So same thing, if we have a diabetes diagnosis, we are at a higher risk for having a stroke, or you can just in general have what's called peripheral vascular disease. It just means your blood vessels are not as healthy, you don't heal as well, sometimes you have poor circulation. This is, of course, in very, very severe cases. Sometimes people actually, this doesn't happen much in the US anymore, but some folks have had to have amputation of limbs as a result of diabetic complications due to peripheral vascular disease. So we've got symptoms that occur with little blood vessels and big blood vessels that occur with this. Now, we can see there's also some other things. As we do more research with diabetes, we're realizing that some of the other conditions that we face in our world are really being linked back to blood sugar. For example, Alzheimer's disease is widely known and called now as type 3 diabetes. There used to be a lot of focus on amyloid plaque deposition in the brain as being the main reason for Alzheimer's, but increasingly we're realizing that it's actually impaired blood glucose control in the blood vessels of our brain that set the environment for this to develop. So this is now this is known as type 3 diabetes. Most types of cancer are going to be worse if we have impaired blood sugar control or if we have elevated blood sugar, particularly cancers of the breast, stomach, colorectal, endometrial, or uterine and prostate cancer. We know that the liver, we're going to talk about the liver, obesity, increased risk for infections, skin conditions, erectile dysfunction, PCOS. All of these are very closely associated with impaired blood sugar. So the symptoms of it are not just limited to one diagnosis. Sometimes people have these diagnoses, and when you're working with, especially as a functional medicine doctor, we're looking at all the elements of health. We're saying, hey, the real issue behind this or this, we need to start focusing on better improving blood sugar control, and that will really help. So let's now look at I mentioned this a little bit about it. There are it can cause serious complications. In the United States, I mentioned this, the diabetes is now the leading cause for some of these really traumatic things like blindness, kidney failure, heart disease, stroke. And what's interesting is that we have been investing a lot of effort and money in recent years into managing blood sugar, which is interesting. That's what a lot of the focus in diabetes cares. We're going to stabilize blood sugar. And that's good. And what that does, that sort of stops the progression of the sugars, of just like the sugar-specific symptoms. However, there's another problem underneath just elevated blood sugar, which is too much insulin. And that's often not addressed when we're managing diabetes. And we still continue to have elevated insulin. And that is what leads to the complications eventually, which we're going to explain in a second. A lot of focus on our treatments have been to just control blood sugar without focusing on insulin. And because we see there's increased levels of a lot of these complications, even though most people now have stabilized blood sugar or controlled blood sugar. So there's something we're missing. So we're going to get into that now a little bit, the mechanism and progression. Now, this section is a little bit technical. We'll try not to go in too deep here. On the other side of this is we're going to get into the practical applications. But I'm going to try to follow along as much as you can. We're going to talk about really what happens in the cells when we have this. And if we understand the cellular mechanism and progression of diabetes, then we're really going to understand why some of the lifestyle steps we can take are practical. So if it gets a little bit over your head here for a second, that's okay. Stay with me. We'll circle back here. All right. So we were talking a little bit about insulin at the very first section. I talked about insulin is released when we make food, or when we eat food. We eat food, we secrete insulin. Okay, that makes sense. Food is broken down into, we might call it macronutrients. We've all probably heard of this, carbs, fats, proteins. We got other groups, we got vitamins, minerals, fibers, phytonutrients. We got our macronutrients. Okay, when we eat food, any food, I don't care what you eat, if you eat an avocado, if you eat a salad, if you eat whatever, you're going to secrete insulin. That's a natural physiological response. Amen for that. We couldn't live without that. But insulin levels are not secreted at the same level for all types of food. So we look at this, insulin, carbohydrates tend to lead to the most insulin secretion. Proteins lead to a little bit of insulin secretion. Fats don't really lead to that much of an insulin secretion. So different types of macronutrients in food result in different levels of insulin being secreted. All right, we all got that. Now, insulin, remember I said at the very beginning, insulin's main job is to take the nutrition, the macronutrients from the food, and move it into the cells for storage. That's a good thing, it needs that. So it's going to move the glucose into our cells. It's going to move some of the protein and amino acids into our cells. But then if we have leftover glucose, let's say we've moved all the glucose into our cells, and there's leftover, then it's going to tell the liver, insulin says, hey liver, store this extra glucose. And it's going to store that as we call glycogen. It's going to store that up. And so then if we fill the liver up with glycogen, and the body still has more sugars and carbohydrates to store, well, insulin's going to say to the liver to do something else. It's going to say, okay, liver, there's no more space because there's anatomical limitations in the liver. There's no more space for glycogen stores. We can't leave the sugar in the vessels. So then what we're going to do, we're going to turn the sugars into triglycerides. Triglycerides are sort of our backup battery of energy. You might say it's really fat tissue. The liver takes sugars, turns it into triglycerides, and then releases those triglycerides out to our body. So we're all tracking so far what insulin does when we eat food. All right, we all put the thumbs up. So we got some nodding heads. All right, good. So insulin, it directs the glucose into our cells so we can use it, and then it stores glucose. Okay, great. So that's when we're eating. But what happens when we're not eating? Okay, sometimes we're not eating, we're fasting. Well, insulin levels go very low because insulin is secreted when we eat, not when we don't eat. So for fasting, insulin goes low. And so then what do? Well, then we start to burn off those two things that the insulin told us to just make. The liver made glycogen, back up glucose, and it made fat tissue. And if we fast, especially for a little bit longer period of time, rather than making more, we start using and burning up those supplies. So it goes in both directions. See, this is how we can maintain balance and energy. So an elevation of insulin leads to the storage of these energy. Low levels of insulin allow us to then utilize our stored energy. We all got that so far? All right, got some nodding heads, that's good. This is happening all the time, constantly, every minute of every day in our life. If we're feeding or fasting, this is metabolism, really. This is how we're storing and using stored energy back and forth. And if we do this, if we're eating a balanced meal, and we have balanced feeding and fasting windows, then this will all be fine. This will be good, and we won't have problems. We'll have balanced weight, balanced metabolism. So what happens if this goes wrong? Well, can we get too much insulin? Can there be too much of a good thing, which can cause some problems? Well, yes, there can. What about if I am eating more often than I'm fasting? If I got 24 hours out of the day, and I'm going to be in a feeding window 20 of those hours, and I'm only in a fasting window 4 of those hours. All right, I have insulin being secreted more often than it's not. All right, what about if I'm eating far more macronutrients than I actually need? What if I only need, let's say, I don't know, 2,200 calories worth of macronutrients, but I eat 4,000 calories of macronutrients? All right, I'm going to have a lot of insulin. What if I'm eating too many carbohydrates, especially the refined and processed and highly addictive sugars, in proportion to my other macronutrients, like my proteins, my fibers, and my fats? If any one of those 3 things occur, guess what happens? I make excessive insulin. Too much insulin. All right, for any one of those 3 reasons. So that's going to result in something. Insulin's going to keep doing what it's supposed to do, but now there's going to be consequences to that. Our cells are going to start getting stuffed and stuffed and stuffed with more glucose until eventually there's no more space left in the cells because we have too much of this. Then we're going to start making lots and lots of triglycerides because we just learned that's sort of the consequence of the pathway. And then we're going to start having to distribute those triglycerides all around our body for backup energy. In other words, too much insulin makes us gain weight and it stuffs our cells with glucose. All right, so this could happen if we have too much insulin. Are we all tracking so far with this? I know this is the technical part, but it's going to circle around here. Too much insulin leads to insulin resistance. Now, this is an interesting concept, right? If we have, as a human, if we have an excessive exposure to something, we can become resistant to that. Many of us inherently know this. How many times maybe you were on a medication and you started off at a very low dose, but then that dose wasn't high enough for you anymore, and you had to increase it, and then you were on that for a couple of years, and had to increase it. Exposure leads to resistance, right? This is the best example, but many times people who are alcoholics, they start off with just a little bit of alcohol till eventually they need more and more and more and more. Exposure to something leads to resistance. I would say overexposure to something leads to resistance. Well, we just looked at 3 scenarios in which we can become overexposed to insulin. Insulin's not bad, but if we have too much of it, guess what happens in our bodies? We develop resistance to insulin. And that if we go back to the very first section, resistance to insulin is the undercurrent that moves the changes in our body from good blood sugar control to prediabetes to diabetes to insulin-dependent diabetes. What's happening is, as our cells are getting stuffed full of glucose, insulin just can't get them in anymore. There's no more space. Literally, there are space limitations on our cells. And so the cells will resist the insulin. And so over time, as we have this, we develop insulin resistance, overexposure leads to that. So we see that happening. Now, okay, all right, Ryan, we got insulin resistance. Well, why is that a problem? Well, this is why insulin resistance is a problem. You see, in our body, what it does, it doubles down. If the body says, okay, the cells are resisting insulin, we're going to make more insulin to try to force the job to get done. Because the body's not getting the feedback cues that insulin's doing its job. So what happens for insulin resistance? Our levels of insulin go higher, 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 and higher. So that when you go to the doctor and you get your blood insulin checked, that's why I said at the beginning, if your insulin's under 10, 2 to 8 is really good. 20, 30, 40, 50 for fasting insulin, that means your body is producing tons of insulin. Why? Because it's trying to force the job to get done. So once our cells resist the insulin due to lack of space, our bodies make more insulin to force it. This results in more. Cells get even more stuffed with glucose. The liver is completely maxed out of glycogen stores. The liver is churning out fat as fast as it can produce. That's the only other pathway it can store all this backup energy. It's churning out all these triglycerides. And then eventually, we can't even keep up with it so much, our blood sugar levels themselves start to rise. And our blood sugar levels are rising and rising because there's just nowhere else for the glucose to go. Because the system is working as fast as it can, but you can see there's a backup. Diabetes is diagnosed with high blood sugar. This is kind of making it full circle. All types of diabetes, we know we get diagnosed with too much blood sugar. This is sort of what's happening behind the scenes in the body to lead us to that. And then our sugar's backed up, which then the too much sugar leads to the damage in the blood vessels we were talking about. So then what happens if we continue to live days, months, years with this going on, as many Americans are? Well, here's what happens. We start to have this, there's several things that happen. The first thing is we start to get fat deposition all through our body because we're making triglycerides from our liver, and then we're getting these fatty stored tissues everywhere, so we start to get fatty liver, that affects our liver. We get fatty muscles, that affects our muscle function. We get fatty pancreas, that affects the other hormones the pancreas is doing. We get fatty tissue pretty much everywhere. This is creating inflammation, making us tired, making our systems not working as well. That's because now we're learning the different steps. We see why this is happening. The second thing is we're having constant high blood sugar. So our blood sugar is high all the time, and the high blood sugar is damaging the walls of our blood vessels. Our little blood vessels, our microvasculature, and our big blood vessels. That's how we get the symptoms. So you can see how it's kind of coming full circle here. We look at the mechanism of this, and then eventually we get to a point where our blood sugar is high enough that we meet criteria for diabetes. We go to the doctor, and the doctor says, hey, you have high blood sugar, you have diabetes. We're going to start doing things to keep your blood sugar in a certain range. But what we don't talk about is the insulin. We don't address the insulin. The insulin stays high. We still continue to have high insulin. We still can have high insulin resistance, even if we're controlling our blood sugar levels. And the high insulin behind the scenes is causing all this insulin resistance. You can kind of see you're following this, right? This is why there's some complications of this. Eventually, and this isn't for everyone, but sometimes people can get so insulin resistant that the pancreas itself cannot produce enough insulin. It's suffocated because of fatty deposition in the pancreas, but it's churning out as much as it can. It can't produce enough, and that is when a person has to start taking external insulin to regulate their blood sugar levels. So now we can see, you're all getting sort of a little class on, we're seeing how a person goes from blood sugar control, insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes, to insulin-dependent diabetes. All of that is this progression of the uncontrolled insulin resistance behind the scenes. How many of you have ever heard it laid out like this before, sort of in a sequential way? So a couple of you have heard this like this. Okay, all right. So, that's a lot. I know, I'm sort of talking about it, right? So I know it's a lot. That's the technical part. How we eat, when we eat, what we eat affects the insulin we're producing. What are we eating the macronutrients? When are we eating? How are we eating? That affects our insulin. Too much insulin leads to overfilling of our cells, excessive fat production. Over time, persistent exposure to insulin leads to resistance. There's no more space. Insulin resistance leads to excessive fat production and fat deposition all over our bodies. And then insulin resistance leads to a backlog of glucose damaging our vessels. All right, that's sort of the summary of what the little journey we were just on, the mechanism. All right, so you can see why this is a serious thing, and we want to reverse that. Now, a couple of thoughts on this. What I just described there in about 10 minutes, that doesn't happen overnight. This is a process that generally for most people occurs over several years, right? Like this is a slow, relatively silent process that is going on in many people's bodies. Remember, we said that essentially 50% of US adults have either insulin resistance, prediabetes, or diabetes. We saw that with the demographic data. So these changes occur over time. Our lifestyle habits, our dietary habits, our environments are the main variables that are influencing, is this continuing to progress, and at what rate is this continuing to progress? And again, it's not just us in the US, these changes are occurring in individuals all around the world because of some of those universal factors, nutrition changes, lifestyle changes, things like that. So, all of us are somewhere in that process, either from good blood sugar control or all the way to insulin-dependent diabetes. How, what, when do we eat leads to too much insulin? So that's the transition now. It's a stretching break. All right. So if you want to stretch, move a little bit. I know that was the technical part there. Very good. We got some stretching over here. Excellent. So now that we're learning that, what we've talked about so far, we've talked about the definition of diabetes, how we diagnose it with lab work. We've talked about the prevalence and the trends getting worse. We've talked about the symptoms and the complications of diabetes. And now we just talked about sort of the cellular mechanism of insulin and insulin resistance. Now we're going to talk about 5 functional medicine considerations for diabetes, prediabetes, and insulin resistance. So this is where it's going to be more applicable, things we can do. Feel free to take notes, take pictures. One thing I'm just going to share, this is, as I've done different ones of these talks, it's a community health presentation. So these are more universally applicable recommendations that all of us can implement. This isn't where, I'm talking about individually recommending, dose changes on medications or things like that for individuals, right? That's not what I usually do for community health talks. So these are more educational recommendations that we all want to implement. So, first one, number 1, cut the sugar now. That's the most important one, right? Cut the sugar now. Well, we are all probably starting to understand why that's important, right? How it's excessive levels of added sugars and refined carbohydrates move this along, right? So the first thing really, right, severely reducing or eliminating consumption of refined grains, highly processed sugars, added sugars, is really one of the most fundamental steps. Why is that? Well, because we just learned all of this can be, on a cellular level, taken back down to insulin resistance, and insulin's mainly produced when we eat food, principally high sugar. There is no type of food, there's no type of macronutrient food that leads to higher levels of insulin production than added sugars or refined carbohydrates. They spike it faster than anything else. So what happens is, these foods that have a lot of added sugars and refined carbohydrates have an unnatural amount of that, so therefore they require an unnaturally high amount of insulin to get that unnaturally high amount of sugars and refined carbohydrates into our cells, right? So that's why this is so important. So, and we are seeing, if we look at the diets, that especially in Western nations, we are having an astronomical increase in foods that have added sugars and refined carbohydrates. Now, some of us are aware of this, some of us may not be aware of this. If we can get rid of the added sugar, we can cut the snake at the head, really, right? Because immediately you're going to stop the insulin elevation, and then that's the key to slowing down the resistance and stuff. So let's look a little bit more at this. We're going to talk a little bit about this. Now, fructose and glucose, it's a little bit technical. Fructose is interesting. Some of you may study biochemistry, some of you maybe you didn't. So we got different types of sugars. We have glucose and fructose. These are carbohydrates. These are molecules, just about chemistry molecules, right? Sucrose, table sugar. When you get just sugar, sucrose is about 50% glucose and 50% fructose on a molecular level, right? Half and half. All right. Fructose isn't really used for energy as much. Now, there's a couple of other things in the body that fructose does. We don't want to totally rule out fructose. We can get enough of it from a little bit of fruit. but fructose is not mainly used for energy production. It's glucose that's mainly used for energy production. Fructose comes into the body and it pretty much has to be metabolized out by the liver. In a little bit it's fine, that's where there's some other processes and other systems we need it for, but in general, many people are getting too much fructose, and then that's causing the liver to immediately have to start working these pathways we talked about, the glycogen and fat stores, to metabolize it out. Now, going back about a century, in 1900, a person, average American, was eating about 15 grams of fructose daily. Mainly that came from fruit consumption. Everything from tomatoes, apples, bananas, whatever, pears, just because we do need some. So they were usually getting about 15 grams daily, pretty good. After about 2010, the average American's eating up to around 100 grams of fructose every day. Far more than what our bodies require and need. The majority of the fructose that we get is from added sugars, specifically high fructose corn syrup, and as well as artificial, just straight up added sugar, sucrose, which is 50% glucose and 50% fructose. So we're getting about, on average, Americans are getting about 5 to 6 fold more than we used to get, far more than we need of fructose, and this is just really driving this process. So how do we cut out sugars and refined carbs? Some of you here probably read nutrition labels. Raise your hand if you read nutrition labels. Okay, good. You've all seen the line, right? We've got calories, fats, monounsaturated, saturated fats, got your fibers, proteins, total carbohydrates. Then you'll see a line under total carbohydrates, added sugars, right? Added sugars in the nutrition label. That means in that product, there has been sucrose just straight up added to that, for no other reason other than to just make it taste better, be more addictive. It's not a constituent part of the food. It's just added sugars. It's not naturally occurring carbohydrates, added sugars. This isn't everything. A good rule of thumb, a take-home point that would help every one of us in this room. Set a goal daily. Keep that total, cumulative total, under 20 to 30 grams a day. So that means, adding this up, looking at your labels, under 20 to 30 grams. That's going to be a really good level to keep all these processes under control. Now, where do we find added sugar? We all know that they're going to get added sugar in things like ice cream and Twinkies and, Snickers, of course. Did you know that added sugar is in a lot more than that, though? Of course, so we know we've got, our sodas, extremely high iced tea, sports drinks, Gatorades, anybody that's doing mixed alcoholic drinks, fruit juices are filled with added sugar, enhanced sugary water, creamers, drink powder packets. Liquid IV has 40 grams of added sugar in a packet. Some of them do. There's different sizes. Dessert, of course we know we get added sugars with cookies and cakes and pastries and things like that. Did you know that a lot of ketchup, barbecue sauce, soy sauce, relish has added sugars in it, tons of it. Salad dressings have a lot of added sugar in them. Right? Peanut butter can sometimes have added sugar. High fructose corn syrup and Jif peanut butter, right? So we've got our spaghetti sauces have added sugar in them. You can turn around Prego tomato sauce. You've got about 20 grams of added sugar in your Prego. We know that dry fruit flavored drinks, fruit roll-ups, apple sauces, yogurts, Dannon yogurts have a lot, cereals, granola bars. Even processed meats can sometimes have added sugar in them. Added sugar is put in a lot of things. It's not just in desserts. Let me show you a couple examples here. The average yogurt cup. Go to the store, get a Yoplait, get a Dannon, whatever. Going to have your Oikos. There's some that don't have sugar, but the ones that on average, you're looking at about 15 to 20 grams of added sugar for just an average little yogurt cup. All right. What about a can of soda? Right. Well, this is the famous one that always gets attacked as it should because there's a lot, but we're looking at 40 to 60 grams of added sugar for one can of soda. Now remember, our rule is to not lead to excessive insulin production. We want to keep it under what number? 20 to 30 daily, cumulatively, right? So if we're kicking back a couple cans of Sprite and Coke, we're already pushing 100 to 120 added sugars just from the drink. Then we're going to have our, what about our barbecue sauce? A tablespoon of barbecue sauce. A tablespoon. We're looking at about 30 to 40 grams of added sugar. A crumble cookie. I don't know if crumble cookies are over here. Up in Virginia Beach, it's like, how many of you even heard of crumble cookie? Oh, you've heard of it. Did you know a crumble cookie has up to 80 grams of added sugar in it? One crumble cookie. You go and you get an Otis Spunkmeyer muffin, at the breakfast bar. you're looking at about 20 to 30 grams of sugar. Breakfast cereal, 10 to 20 grams. A Nature Valley bar, a lot of them have 6 to 10 grams of added sugar. What about you're gonna go to Starbucks, you're gonna get your cappuccino, mocha, you know, the cream, the fuzz, the white, all the things in it, right? You're gonna be looking at about 60 grams of added sugar in your Starbucks mocha. A fruit roll-up bar, 8 to 10 grams of Gatorade or a Red Bull, 30 to 50 grams. So let's think about the average American breakfast, right? We're gonna get our little muffin, we're gonna have our yogurt, we're gonna have our orange juice, we're gonna have our white bread toast, and we're gonna put our fruit preserve on it. We're looking at easy 120 grams of added sugar for breakfast alone, right there. You know? And then we're gonna eat a couple of Nature Valley bars in the day, and then on the way to work, we're gonna grab our Starbucks mocha. People are eating, many Americans are consuming between 400 to 500 grams of added sugar per day. Right? So, you know, is it any wonder now, okay, so we're just at the first of our 5 points, but is it any wonder now we're starting to see putting the links together, okay, now we look at the habits of society as a whole, the foods that are made available to us, the convenience foods that are made available to us, society as a whole, we can see why prevalence of blood sugar dysregulation conditions like this are increasing, right? Okay, so we want to keep our added sugars in there now. So how are we going to do this? This is the first point. We're going to move to the next point. So how are we going to do this? We want to start, I mentioned this is actually the first point was cutting out added sugars. The second thing is refined carbohydrates. Now, do you know what I mean when I say refined carbohydrates? Carbohydrates aren't bad. God made grains, you know, seeds, vegetables, He made all kinds. Carbs are good. Grains naturally have, in their natural state, grains have fat, protein, fiber, and carbs all in one. It's amazing, actually. But what mankind has done to grains, we highly process them. First of all, we genetically modify them. We strip the nutrients out of it, and then we bleach them. We enrich them with synthetic forms of folic acid, and then we put them into foods like crackers and pasta and muffins and white breads and things like that, which now we have grains that pretty much to the body are so processed, they're just like added sugar. There's no digestion that needs to happen. There's no breakdown that needs to happen. When you are having white crackers, white bread, white, flour, all of that highly processed grains, when you put that into the body, that is metabolized very differently than if you were to go get like a sprouted grain bread or quinoa or couscous or buckwheat or like a real grain. Your body's going to break that down. Refined grains are pretty much like added sugars. They're going to spike it just like that. So we want to be avoiding our highly processed and refined grains. We're going to get those in a lot of our conventionally available breads, pastas, crackers, baked goods, cereals, things like that. We really want to, the beautiful thing is you can find options though for these that are healthier, that aren't as heavily processed. We also want to limit our moderately refined grains. This will be things like popcorn or corn chips, or even like so-called whole grain breads, some granolas. We have to cut those out completely, but we want to limit those. And also really, really high glycemic, just like white rice, white potatoes, sweet corn, organic oats. This is if you're diabetic. I want to put a caveat, if you're diabetic. If you are pre-diabetic or insulin resistant, you can also, one of the things we're going to talk about is balancing macronutrients. You can slow metabolism down, but if you have straight up diabetes, you also want to be avoiding the high glycemic foods. So we're limiting our added sugars, we're limiting our refined carbohydrates, and so what are we going to eat instead? Okay, Ryan, all right, well, we're going to start, what can I eat? What about the grains? We need to get some grains. Well, this is where we want to start transitioning to more whole food grains. In their more God-made natural state that have the fibers, proteins, fats, and carbs in them, right? So there's an abundance of whole grains. And I tell you what, my wife and I do this a lot. Like, we eat a lot of whole grains, and you get full. And you're not spiking your blood sugar, and you actually get all kind of textures and different. There's so many amazing grains. There's barley, quinoa, amaranth, buckwheat, bulgur, teff, farro, fricka, wild brown rice, millet, rye, ancient grains. There's, sprouted grain breads, like Ezekiel breads and things like that. So much more nourishing, so much more filling, so much more nutritious, and you're not going to be spiking the blood sugar like that. Tubers, fiber-rich tubers and fiber-rich vegetables are going to be super good for this. Now, what about fruits? Fruits are amazing. We need some fructose. Fruits are super healthy. Now, if somebody is, this is where, when I'm individually meal planning with patients, sometimes we have to be a little more strict than others. Some people have really impaired blood sugar control. A general rule of thumb, just think of fruits, I like to think of fruits as God's natural dessert that He gave to mankind, right? First of all, if we're eating fruits as our desserts, we will have a sensitivity to to the level of sweetness in the fruits, which we obliterate that sensitivity if we're eating, high sugar foods all the time. Fruits are no longer palatable because we're wanting such a higher level concentration of sugar. So if we're eating fruits as God's dessert that He gave us, that's fine, and we do need some fructose, but we don't want to abuse fruits. We don't want to be eating them all the time. And again, this is where coming down to the nuance of fruits in particular can vary a little bit depending on where a person might be on their actual blood sugar levels. Healthy fats are a great thing to do in place of refined carbohydrates. Think about avocados, nuts, seeds. If you're going to do eggs, pasture-raised eggs are the best. If you're going to do fish, wild-caught, never farm-raised are the best for fish. Coconuts and olives are healthy fats. So here's a couple of examples of that. Now, our second point, so the first one is cut the sugar now. Our second point is balancing macronutrients. This is a natural progression from what I was just talking about. We were talking about macronutrients. We have fats, fibers, proteins, carbs. Let's talk a little bit about this. So blood sugar is stabilized. It is controlled. It doesn't go up and down. No major highs, no crashing lows when we have all macronutrients on board. And that's a great thing. It's an interesting thing. So I'm going to just kind of share a little. This was a study that was done. So there was a nutritional study that was done. People went and they drank apple juice. Okay, so you get apple juice and you get a bunch of apples and you grind it up, right? And you just have essentially sugar water at that point because all the fiber's gone. So you just have apple juice. And you drink the apple juice, and then 15 minutes later you measure the blood glucose, and then 30 minutes later you measure the insulin. Okay, it's pretty high. Really high, okay, because honestly it's kind of sugar water. So then you do the same thing just eating apples. Now you have the carbohydrates that were in the juice, but what do you have that you didn't have before? You have the fiber, right? You measure the blood glucose 15 minutes later and insulin 30 minutes later. It was significantly lower. Then you put that apple with something like almond butter, cashew butter, peanut butter, some kind of nut butter. Now you have fats and proteins, in addition to your carbs and fibers. Measure your blood sugar, 15 minutes, and insulin, it was the lowest ever at all. Controlled blood glucose because you're balancing macronutrients. So we want to think about our meals. Every meal that we're eating should have some kind of a healthy fat, fiber, protein, or carb. We want to get familiar, first of all. So some of us are familiar, some of us aren't familiar on where we even get these macronutrients in food. We want to start becoming familiar about what macronutrients look like in food. And we look at our meals, we want to represent these. We want to represent healthy fat, fiber, protein, and carbs. We know that healthy fats provides lasting energy, healthy protein doesn't. Fats and proteins don't spike insulin as much as sugar does anyway. Here's a couple of general, again, this is sort of general advice here, good targets to think about. For those with pre-diabetes or diabetes, some ranges we might think about is you're looking at your total intake of nutrition per day. 20 to 30% could be coming from healthy sources of fats, 30 to 40% from healthy sources of proteins, 40 to 50% from healthy sources of carbs, and aiming to get about 20 to 30 grams of fiber a day. That's a pretty good ratio. You can get in that. That's going to be nicely balanced. You do pretty good blood sugar control, nice amount of fiber. That's a good target. Now, so you might be thinking, all right, well, Ryan, what are some examples? Where do I even get this from? These are a couple of slides. These are just from I use many different dietary guides with patients. This is one from the Institute for Functional Medicine, where this is my training. This is from a cardiometabolic diet plan where they essentially send us home with patients. And it's a shopping list. And in the shopping list, I broke it apart for the slides. In the shopping list, they list the macronutrient at the top. And so people can start to become aware of what healthy sources of macronutrients can be. So again, carbohydrates. We don't want to be getting our carbohydrates from our refined sugars, our white breads, or white pastas, right? So where are we going to get it from? Here's some great sources, right? So first of all, like beverages. Okay, here's some beverages, unsweetened, no sugar added. Starchy vegetables. All right, here's some great sources of healthy carbs: our squashes, plantains, and some different colors, potatoes, some yams, root vegetables. That's nice. Also, all of these guys. Now notice, this is from a diet plan specifically targeting people that are either pre-diabetic or early stage diabetes. So you can even see up here sort of the serving sizes. We want to do some of that, but we don't want to go overboard. What we definitely can do a lot of are non-starchy vegetables. The main macronutrient is carbohydrates. A lot of us don't realize that when you're eating vegetables, you're getting healthy carbs. In addition to that, you're getting millions of phytonutrients that give the colors to those foods, which are super good at reducing inflammation, cellular energy. Here's a bunch of things. Now, some of these things we might not even heard of. Like, who here has even escarole. I mean, there's a lot of vegetables in God's kingdom that we can start eating and using that are healthy and nutritious. All right, so this is just a couple of examples of healthy carbs. We're going to move through. What about some more? All right, fruits. Here's some healthy sources of fruits, ideally unsweetened, just like natural fruits, some apples. You can get some proteins. There's different types. There's animal-based and plant-based milks, all of which have proteins in them. So developing a familiarity. Remember, we want to be representing macronutrients on our plate. The last one is about fibers. Fibers control the rate at which we are metabolizing food. It's not formally a macronutrient, but I usually group it in there because we want to think about it that way. There's soluble, there's insoluble fibers as well. We find that mainly in root vegetables, some more fruits, some certain grains. So that's the second principle. We want to be balancing our macronutrients. So first principle is cut the sugar now. Second principle, balance macronutrients. Okay, and then, all right, the last slide on this is something I want to encourage you to do. It's a great little exercise. So each one of you, now it's not perfect, certainly not perfect, but this is a little exercise you could do if you wanted to. There's all kind of calculators online. You can type in macronutrient calculator for me, and you can put in your height, your age, your weight, your goals, and you can get a sense of your macronutrient targets. On average, these are again averages, trying to speak to a group, average adults generally fall somewhere. I do personalized calculations for patients all the time on care planning, but usually we're falling generally somewhere in there for calories, 90 to 100-ish grams of protein, 40 to 60 grams-ish of fats, 200 to 300 grams of carbs. Sort of just average ratios for that. All right, let's go to third one here, timing of our meals to start fasting. Now this is a really important one. So we talked about number one, our first step is to cut the sugar now. Start trying to keep our added sugars under 20, 30 grams, balance macronutrients. This is one I really want you to hear, and then we just have a couple more after that, which will be a little shorter. Start fasting. Remember, insulin is secreted when we eat food. Insulin is not secreted when we don't eat food. So we've been talking about insulin and insulin resistance and how mechanistically it's the whole root of all of this. So guess what happens when we fast? We don't eat food. Insulin levels go down. If exposure to insulin leads to insulin resistance, non-exposure to insulin reverses insulin resistance and increases insulin sensitivity. In fact, there is nothing more powerful to resensitize insulin receptors than fasting. Fasting is the most effective way to regain the sensitivity back. Now, some of us, if you might have done this, some of you might have fasted from different things before. Sometimes people go on a sugar fast, for example. Let's say you used to eat a bunch of candy bars and ice cream and stuff, and you said, I'm going to stop this, and you had a certain taste developed in your mouth, but then you went on a 2-week or 3-week sugar fast, and then you ate ice cream after that. That ice cream was super sweet, wasn't it? Why? Because you actually gained sensitivity to the sugar because you became more sensitive after not being exposed to it. The same principle applies to insulin. We can literally reverse insulin resistance with fasting, targeted fasting. It's amazing. Fasting does 2 things for this. Number one, it reverses insulin resistance because not exposure. Secondly, when we're fasting, guess what else we do? We start burning off all of those stored energy sources that we had built up, we had excessive levels of sugar. Fasting is a great tool for this, right? So when we're fasting, we're reversing this. So we're reversing the resistance, we're burning off the excess sugar. So if we stop putting excess sugar in and we start burning the sugar off, those are the two most important steps to start reversing the insulin resistance that led to diabetes. It's really important. So now let's look about how should we do this. Fasting is not about so much what you're eating, it's about when you're eating. All right, it's about when you're eating. So, and it's not about how much. Like true fasting is not necessarily calorie restriction. Now, a lot of people, just by virtue of eating less frequently, kind of by default have calorie restriction. But that's not necessarily what fasting is about. Fasting is about timing our eating windows and our fasting windows, right? So if you think about, okay, I got 24 hours out of the day. You have, all of us, without knowing it, physiologically have two windows in every day, a feeding and a fasting window. Some of those hours you've been eating within, that's your feeding window. And then you have a big chunk of time generally occurring, including your sleeping time, which is your fasting window. So we, as a general rule, do not want our feeding windows to exceed our fasting windows, as a general rule. If there's 24 hours out of the day, and on average, our feeding windows are 18, 19, 20 hours, or 16 hours, that means that as we're living our life, we're producing insulin more often than we're not producing insulin. And now we've all learned how that can lead to insulin resistance, right? So we want our feeding windows to be less than our fasting windows for sure. And then when we go into our fasting window, we start burning our glycogen and our fat. When we're fasting, you can drink water, lemon water, apple cider vinegar water, herbal tea, and for longer fast, you can do bone broth. So here's a couple of examples. All right, how do we make this practical? How do we do this? There's all kinds of schedules to do this, and some of you have heard this before, some of you haven't heard this before. It's really about dividing that time into segments that make sense. Intermittent fasting is a common term. It's sort of a buzzword. You hear a lot in the news these days in natural intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating. That really just means that people are being intentional about eating within certain windows and then fasting for longer windows. Here's a couple of examples, right? A 14-10 is going to be a 14-hour fast and a 10-hour feeding window. I might start eating at 8 a.m. and I'm done eating by 6 p.m. That's a 10-hour feeding window. That means I'm fasting from 6 p.m. to 8 a.m. That'd be an example of a 14-10. What about a 16-8? Okay, I might start eating at 8 a.m. and that means in 8 hours I'm going to be done eating, would that be at 4 p.m., right? I think 8 hours, yes, 4 p.m. Yeah, because 4 and 4. So I'd be done eating at 4 p.m. and then I'm fasting from 4 p.m. to 8 a.m. That'd be a 16-8. You can divide this in different ways. Remember, you want your feeding window to be longer than your fasting window. You want to be burning more than you're storing, right? So when we are talking about folks who have a lot of insulin resistance, high prediabetes, early diabetes mellitus, this is where we might start to talk about therapeutically and strategically building in longer fasts. Why? Well, because we have insulin resistance we're dealing with. And we need to start scheduling time to start reversing that. And we can do that. And I do this with a ton of patients. So we might start doing, like in general, every day of the week. A good rule of thumb is about a 14-10. It's really, you don't really want to have a feeding window exceeding 10 hours because it takes time for food to be digested. So on average, a good rule, 14 to 16 hour fasting, 8 to 10 hour feeding, but then we might start thinking about, all right, 2 days out of the week, we're going to push it a little bit. And 2 days out of the week, we're going to strategically go an 18 to 24 hour fast or an 18 to 20 hour fast. And why? This is for individuals who have impaired blood sugar control, insulin resistance. We know we're overproducing insulin. We need to resensitize those receptors. We're going to start doing this and watch. And it's amazing. You start doing this. You start losing weight. Blood sugar starts coming down. Insulin resistance starts getting reversed. It's really great. So we might start thinking about, strategically 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Sometimes I've had patients that want to do twice a month, they want to do like a 24 to 36 hour fast. And we've done that. You can schedule this in different ways. If you start pushing to the point of where, we're pushing past 2 days, 3 days, you really want to be doing this with medical supervision. For sure, you don't want to be just doing this on your own. So these are just a couple of examples. There's a lot of ways you can build feeding and fasting windows into your schedule. So a couple notes about fasting. If you are actively taking medications for diabetes, some of you here maybe, some of you may not be, fasting is still a great thing to do, but you need to do this in coordination with your doctor who's prescribing those medications, because you might end up dropping your blood sugar lower if you're actively on drugs that are doing that. So you just want to be working with your doctor. Hey, I want to sort of an intermittent fasting regimen. That's great. To reverse the insulin resistance, that's great. Just do that in coordination with the prescribing provider so that you're not going to have hypoglycemic events. Something else that often happens with fasting. A lot of toxins in our body are stored in our fatty tissues, and when we start to fast, we start to burn through our fatty tissues, which is good, but we tend to mobilize the release of some toxins. So sometimes we might feel a little sick when we're fasting. We detoxify when we fast. We get rid of a lot of waste products. So we have that. The dawn phenomenon, that's a little bit technical. Essentially, when we're fasting, due to cortisol, we can sometimes get a temporary elevation of blood sugar in the morning. That's completely normal. It's very important to stay well hydrated. If you're on an extended fast, it's not the time to go do the CrossFit in the morning if you're on an extended fast. Let's avoid our high intensity, strenuous exercise. And it's also good to vary your regimen. Mix it up. 1 month do a couple of longer days. The next month maybe do 1 day a week, up to 16. Mix it up. And I always recommend, it's good to be doing this, especially if you have a diagnosis you're doing fasting for. Do this in coordination with your provider. All right, a couple more here. Why is exercise good for blood sugar regulation? We know that exercise is good for a lot of things. Why would exercise be good to lower blood sugar? There's 2 reasons. Did you know that muscles are burning glucose about 10 to 16 times faster than fatty tissue? Muscle, just by definition, is metabolically active. If I'm standing here and I have a higher muscle mass, just by existing, I have a higher metabolism, because muscles are constantly burning compared to fatty tissue, which is stored energy, right? So if I can build more muscle mass just by living my life, I am raising my basal metabolic rate no matter what I am, what I'm doing. Which, if I have a higher metabolic rate, I can move through sugars and I can not store up excess sugars as much. So that's the first thing, which is great. So muscles are just metabolically more active. And the only way that any of us can build muscle is through using our muscles through resistance training. Muscles aren't built just standing here, right? We have to exercise to build muscles. When we do, we become a bigger burning machine just by existing. The second reason that exercise helps with diabetes is over and over and over again, consistent exercise routines have been shown to reverse insulin resistance. We know that. Consistent exercise slows the development of everything I've talked about in this talk, and consistent exercise can actually curb and reverse that. So the third reason that exercise helps with diabetes is that exercise helps to increase our blood flow. We sweat, we move blood and lymph through our tissues, and we get rid of a lot of toxins. We haven't touched on it a lot, but there's a lot of toxins that are involved in diabetes. So these are the ways that exercise specifically helps us to reverse diabetes and prediabetes. So how do we do this? It's again about finding something that's sustainable, that works for you, that can be part of your life. A lot of people, when they think about exercise, like, okay, I've got to go to the gym and I've got to do 30 minutes a day of lifting weights. You don't have to do that. There's a lot of ways to get healthy physiologic movement. There's sports, there's outside activities, there's home. People can do, YouTube work. It's incredible now. If you have a smart TV and a mat in your living room, you have access to personal trainers around the entire world who can guide you through any exercise you want to do right there in your living room. It's amazing. So you have that. There's group classes. A lot of times we can build movement into our work. Of course, there is standard resistance training, body weight machines and bands. It's thinking about, okay, we all need to be moving. We want to start building muscle. We could do a whole lecture on other benefits of exercise. We're just thinking right here about the blood sugar benefits. What kind of movement do I like? What brings me joy? What could I do sustainably that could be part of my lifestyle for movement? What can I access? Do you have access to a gym? Do you have access to a smart TV? Do you have access to trainers or nature? What do you have access to that could build in movement? When and where could you move? With whom could you move? Thinking about these things, how you can build a sustainable exercise regimen are some great strategies. So we want to do that too. I know this is long here. The last point here about this, when we're thinking about exercise and building a routine, we just want to have a couple principles that apply. We want to be consistent with it. We want to be doing so. Ideally, we want to be increasing our frequency, but at least maintaining that. At least one, I go to 3 to 5 intentional movement sessions a week for at least 20 to 60 minutes is great. Strength and aerobic is helpful. Strength training is resistance, where we're using our muscles right, body weight bands, machines, whatever, calisthenics. Aerobic is where we're doing something that's putting stressors on our heart and our lungs. Swimming, cycling, running, jogging. We want to get both because both are associated with a million benefits. We want to get both. And the other thing is we want to rotate body groups. We don't just only want to do bicep curls 3 times a week and that's it. And let our core and our back and our trapezius, fall apart. We want to rotate around our bodies, right? So think about, we want to work upper body, lower body, core. We want to rotate. So these are just a couple of principles for exercise. All right. How are we all doing here? I know it's a lot. I know it's a ton of information. There's one more point here. I don't know if I should get into it much. I'm going to do it super fast. This really should probably be its own talk, and then we'll go into questions. We've talked about sugar, macronutrients, fasting, and exercise. The last point here, maybe I can come back and we'll do a whole other big lecture on this. There's a lot of toxins in our environment that actually lead to impaired blood sugar. Lots of them, tons of them. Heavy metals, plastics, there's microplastics that disrupt our hormones, including our metabolic hormones. So there's a whole other topic that we can dive into. I'm just going to just briefly share. There's a lot here. There's over 200 chemicals that are used in commercially available products that have been directly linked to prediabetes and diabetes. We see these in our commercial household products, everything from food packages to furniture. There's several heavy metals, including arsenic, mercury, and lead, have all been shown to increase the development of insulin resistance. This is another one of the major reasons. I talked earlier in the talk about some of the factors in our world that have been driving this epidemic increase. It's not just the nutrition and the lifestyle changes. We are also inundated with a lot of toxins. And so this one, I can go into this more in depth. Perhaps I can do another lecture on this. But this is just one page of several pages of several chemicals that are directly linked to increased risk of diabetes and prediabetes. We find these in everywhere from our cosmetics, shampoos, body care products, the lining of our takeout boxes from the restaurants, all kinds of things, our plastic wraps on your Tide Pods. So we want to, perhaps we can dive into this more. Basic steps, just very basic steps today. We want to think about, it's good to try to get organic produce if you can, especially things like berries and leafy greens that have a very high pesticide residue if they're not organic. You don't want to be cooking food in plastics or drinking water in plastics, Teflon or styrofoam. When we're drinking water in plastics or we're cooking with plastic food, utensils or putting hot food into plastic containers, millions and billions of nanoplastic particles are released into the food. We eat all of that. There's so much research showing the links between hormone dysregulation and microplastic accumulation. And so we really want to start using metals and glass, using less toxic cleaning products, avoiding fragrances, things like that. I know this is a lot. There's a lot more to be said about that. Yeah, just a couple points. So let's summarize it. A couple of resources here. There's some agencies out there that are tracking this. My favorite is the Environmental Working Group. You can download a couple of apps on your phone that you can scan products. They will show you if there's toxicity. Just a couple of things. Campaign for Safe Cosmetics is a great resource for healthy, for lower toxicity cosmetic products as well. So this is another factor that's affecting this epidemic of rise. So to summarize, other steps for future discussion, there's other things that affect blood sugar, everything from sleep affects blood sugar, stress affects blood sugar, huge relationship between the healthy little bacteria in our gut and blood sugar. And then for many patients, when I'm doing personalized care plans, we're using targeted herbal nutrients and supplements to improve all of this as well. So to summarize, we're looking at a couple of key takeaways. It's a marathon talk. You're all doing this, right? Today we've learned diabetes is a global epidemic. It's rising. It's going around the world. We're seeing this as being not just here in the U.S., but in all developed countries, due to nutrition, lifestyle, and environmental factors that have been changing. Those are the principal areas that have been leading this. We've talked about how too much insulin is really at the core. There's too much insulin leads to insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is the phenomena that then moves these conditions down. This is a process that we can diagnose with testing. Lab testing can show That's if we meet criteria. And then here are the 5 different steps that we talked about. Eliminating and reduce our added sugars, keeping added sugars under 20 to 30 grams a day, so not eating all the refined carbs, balancing our macros at every single plate, beginning intermittent fasting. That is such an incredibly important strategy, building fasting into your routine as a way to reverse insulin resistance, building exercise and muscle building, and then some initial steps to reduce toxins. So that will wrap it up. Thank you all for your attention. I hope you've learned something valuable today, and that that was helpful. And so yes, that's what I have to share. And then if there's questions, I'm happy to hear some questions. But thank you all for your attention.
Hello.
Hi.
Over the last several months, I've watched a lot of videos and I've read a lot of articles about statin drugs.
Yeah.
And before 1980, there was hardly any Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
And it's just been increasing. And you go to the doctor and they put everybody on statin drugs. And I had been on them and I cut it out completely. You know, the cholesterol is, you got to have the cholesterol for your brain and such like that. What's your feeling on that? Am I off the wall? Because I told my doctor I'm not taking them anymore.
Yeah, statins are very widely prescribed. They are, so statins lower LDL cholesterol is what they do. They interfere with an enzyme, the H&B-CoA reductase enzyme, to prevent the production really of LDL cholesterol. And so you do have total cholesterol that comes down. There's been also a number of larger studies that have looked at long-term mortality decreases in uses of statins, and it's not as impressive as what you'd like it to see. That statins, while they control, it's interesting you asked that. I'm sort of talking about how we approach diabetes is just stabilizing blood sugar while not addressing underlying factors. I could do a whole other talk about cholesterol and vascular inflammation, the same theme. In this country, we focus on controlling LDL cholesterol, mainly through statins. But we miss some underlying physiologic factors that are very big that lead to atherosclerosis, mainly vascular inflammation. And also not all LDL is the same. Just getting a lipid panel and getting total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, that's not all. There are subtypes of LDL, small dense particles, ApoB, ApoA, oxidized LDL, lipoprotein little a, if those are elevated, a person is at much greater risk for a cardiac event compared to not. So I think that, so I don't use statins, I don't prescribe statins. There's also an abundance of I'm a naturopathic doctor. So admittedly, my area of expertise is more in foundations of health, lifestyle medicine, nutritional medicine, herbal medicines. I am familiar with pharmaceuticals and I have prescribed pharmaceuticals, but there's so many other tools at my disposal as a naturopathic doctor that I use those to lower blood lipids. This is one of them. But really the thing, and I know it's a little bit different than blood sugar talk, the thing about cholesterol, in order to have atherosclerosis, you have to have not just elevated lipids, you have to have certain subtypes of lipids and vascular inflammation. Those two together is what then leads to the combination for the plaques to form. And so in the absence of vascular inflammation, then the LDL becomes a lot less of a concern. Now, there are many patients, several patients including that I've seen, that I've recommended that they continue their statin because they have incredibly high cholesterol. I mean, when it gets to a certain point, we're very, very high, absolutely. But when we're talking about more moderate elevations, so many other tools that don't, there are side effects on muscles, statins deplete B vitamin levels, CoQ10 levels. There's a lot of other tools at disposal that don't have some of those negative side effects, which I think can achieve the same effect even better. I'm biased though, I'm a naturopathic doctor, so that's what I do. So anyway, that's kind of a long answer, but that's what I think about that. So.
How you doing? Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm trying to make it quick.
Okay.
I'm serious about this.
Okay.
Let me ask you real quick. Which broth? I got bone broth and I got chicken broth.
Okay.
Organic. If I'm fasting, which one is the best?
Well, you mean like from what animal was it made from?
It's
Bone broth.
I got chicken broth and bone, and beef broth. They both are bone.
So yeah, bone broth is essentially broth just made from. You've boiled water from the bones, and it's just.
I bought organic.
Yeah. So here's the thing about bone broth, right? So bone broth has a little bit of fat and protein in it. So technically, Bone broth, if we get into ketosis, so for fasting, there's the different stages of fasting. Once you get past, the first 12 hours of fasting, you move to 12 to 16 hours, then you're burning ketone bodies, and you're not burning glycogen anymore. Because bone broth actually does have a little bit of fat in it, technically it does have a little bit of calorie in it, but you can stay in ketosis for a fast. You can use bone broth to stay fasting from sugars and from an insulin spike after 12 hours once you're in ketosis with bone broth. Just water or herbal teas are the ones that don't have any calories. As far as which one, I don't know that they're, it's organic, bones are bones.
I will try to make a quick answer. All right. As you can see, I don't need to lose weight, so I've been doing all the things you're talking about. I don't know if I'm diabetic or not.
You should get it checked.
Just for my health. Just for my health. You're not the type of doctor that I don't like. I like you. I like you, doctor. Like she said, they give me all kinds of stuff and poison you. So I've never gone to the doctor. I had a hernia fixed. That was about it. 2 times. But as far as going to them for anything or cold, I don't do none of that. Okay, I'm very healthy. I'm 62 years old. I can take off and fly and run just like when I was 16. But let me say this real quick. I want to let everybody else go. I'm going to go home and do this stuff. Okay, so I don't need to lose weight. Okay. So I've been eating bread. I'm eating the nuts and vegetables, everything. Only thing bad I was doing was eating the dates, the dry. And it said they're no good. So
Dave, let me make a caveat, right? So, and this is where it gets a little challenging when trying to do like a general health rip. So, Dave, it all depends on where you are. This is where there's value in testing, right? If you were to go and get your glucose checked and your insulin checked and you realize, hey, I got great blood sugar control, I got a good fasting insulin, and you don't have insulin resistance, you don't have prediabetes, you don't have diabetes, you're eating a balanced diet, you're drinking water, you're exercising, you're generally avoiding added sugar, that's great. Like, do you need to worry about dates? No, you don't need to worry about dates, right? So now if we're talking about, someone who has, a fasting glucose in the 200s, has a fasting insulin in the 50s, yeah, I'm going to say we want to be careful for any kinds of highly metabolized more sugars, right? I don't know that you would need to avoid dates, right? Dates are fine. They're actually a great way to bring some sweetening in using fruits to agents.
I want to put on muscle, doc, not lose it. So since I've been doing that, I'm getting skinnier. Now I can pack on muscle.
There you go.
That's not a problem. I want to keep muscle. So since I've been doing that, I feel good, but I'm
so to build muscle,
I don't want to be thin like that. I don't want to feel like that.
So this is where macro calculations, right? This is where, and this is a great exercise for all of you. You can go to a website, you can type in, a macro calculator. You can put in your age, your height, male, your frequent, I work out 3-4 times a week, and it'll bring up a list, and it'll give you a list. Okay, it's like your target for like protein and carbs needs to be in this range. For building muscle, you need to be having consistent resistance training with additive weight over time, right? You need to be having enough complex carbohydrates and proteins to remember, and you need to be sleeping enough. We build muscle at night when you sleep. So if you are not sleeping, if you're deficient in proteins and carbs, you don't have additive weight increase, you're not going to build muscle.
Okay, last thing. All right, so I do that. I love to have you working out in the background.
Okay.
It's getting better now. All right, so now here's the thing. So now I noticed that, I'm drinking protein powder, I increase my caloric intake and everything.
Yes.
And believe me, it gets results. But I noticed that as soon as I get back from the gym or whatever, even before I'm telling you, I don't know if the insulin spike, I'm falling asleep. Is that good or bad? Like as soon as I'm finished working out, I get home, I'm eating like 5 meals, maybe 3 times, 3 hours, whatever I'm doing. Sometimes they say that's good, that's what I like to do. But when I get home and
after working out,
I come home. It's almost like it's like a coma. I'm going out. But listen now. But when I wake up, man,
you're feeling good.
Man, whoa, this is what I want. Is that bad? Is that bad?
Well, how long are you sleeping? Like you just take
I might take some zinc and magnesium or something. After I ate, I took some zinc and magnesium or something. And I might just sit on the couch and recline away from work. But by that time, I nod out. I feel it. I nod out. I'm out.
Well,
But when I wake up,
then you wake up
3 hours. Or even when I wake up, man.
Then you feel good. Well, yeah, because we build muscle overnight. I mean, if you're I'm presuming.
Is my insulin is something wrong?
Well, insulin isn't, so sleeping isn't as closely, insulin's tied to when we're eating. Sleeping is very, so I guess, yeah, I mean, blood sugar does affect sleep. Adrenals certainly affect sleep. Environment affects sleep. You know, if you're going and doing a big stressor on your body and a big workout, it's possible you might be dropping hypoglycemic, making you tired. Your adrenals might be dropping lower. And I guess it would depend on what time of the day it's happening. I guess I'm thinking, I'm not sure like if this is happening in the morning or afternoon.
Whenever I do it.
Whenever you do it. I wonder whether you may be a little hypoglycemic. If you're going and doing an intense workout, I'm wondering if you're telling me that you're not seeing the muscle growth as consistent and then you're falling asleep after meals. You are seeing, okay, you are seeing, well that's, okay. I wonder if you're getting enough caloric intake. I would encourage you to do a macronutrient calculator. Put in the amount of exercise you do per week and look at that target macros, try to get that. That would be my encouragement for that.
So don't take things like precursors, like I take IGF-1, don't do that kind of stuff. I might take a precursor for my IGF-1. Yes, it makes you naturally produce.
I mean, it's probably okay. Yeah, the insulin growth factor, that could be okay. Yeah. All right, yes.
Okay, so I am diabetic, but I've been working getting under control. My blood sugar is around 300 to 500 on average, probably for about 4 years. So I am 36, and I got my A1C, went from a 13, now it's a 7. So I'm doing things, and I'm losing weight and all this stuff, but I have major neuropathy in my legs. We're talking about the blood vessels.
Yeah.
So my question is now, is there any way to, it's gotten better, it's getting better, but is there a way to, with good foods and whatever it is, to fix the damage that's already been done?
Yes, to help to reverse neuropathy, neuropathy. That's a great question, and yeah, there is. And this is where. So, do you have something you could take notes on, like other things? So, this is where I'll just share a couple of initial things. This is where like some targeted supplementation. So, for example, alpha lipoic acid, acetyl L-carnitine, B6 and B12. So I'll share those again. Alpha lipoic acid, ALA, alpha lipoic acid, acetyl L-carnitine, B6 and B12, all have been shown to reverse diabetic neuropathy. The other thing is, getting overall inflammation levels checked. So like, for example, when patients see me at our clinic, we're doing extensive labs, all the hormones, all the nutrients, all the inflammatory markers. If you still have high levels of inflammation, then there could still be nerve damage. So a couple of labs, I don't know if you have a doctor that you see, but a couple of labs, you might write these down, CRP, ESR, so CRP, that's C-reactive protein, ESR, that's erythrocyte sedimentation rate, CRP, ESR, and then homocysteine. Those are 3 inflammatory markers. If those are elevated, those show that your body's still inflamed. If we're inflamed, there's a cause, there's something triggering that. And so then it starts thinking, and then we've got to start looking and be like, okay, well, am I getting inflammatory foods? Do I have some infection? Do I have exposure to inflammatory toxins? And then you start looking holistically. This is, so like I, as a naturopathic and a functional medicine doctor, like regardless of the individual complaint, every patient, so we're looking at like whole life, like doing extensive labs, looking at all the systems because of how everything integrates. So for something like neuropathy, oh, absolutely. On every patient, checking everything. Sex hormones, metabolic hormones, thyroid hormones, and everybody. So if you're looking at inflammatory markers, so those would be the 2 things. Like specifically, alpha lipoic acid and acetyl L-carnitine, very powerful to reverse that. Also, red light therapy and is to the nerves. There's another type of light therapy that's been shown to reverse diabetic neuropathy in distal nerves as well. And some physical therapy offices will offer the treatments, usually they're 30-minute sessions, that can help to regenerate the nerve activity in the nerves of the feet and the legs. So, yeah, but it sounds like you're making some great steps. Keep up the good work, and I hope some of these things are applicable to you. So, yes.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. Talking about information.
Yeah.
Now, you was talking about the fasting, how the fasting would help the information. Now,
Fasting.
I have lots of information. My A1C rounds like 5.2, 5.4.
Okay.
Pretty good with that. I'm obese. Been working on, I go to the gym a lot and I do work out. But my nutrition said, and I would ask, what foods could I eat that don't cause inflammation?
Oh, yeah?
I Googled everything I looked at, everything I eat causes inflammation.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, so what foods can I eat that don't cause inflammation?
Well, that's a great question. So there's 5 categories of foods that we know across many of us create inflammation. So I'll share the ones that they cause and the ones that don't. So as I mentioned, added sugar. There's nothing more inflammatory in our modern diet than added sugar. It's straight up inflammatory. So added sugars are very inflammatory. Highly processed oils. So we look at a lot of our processed foods that are very shelf stable. Our vegetable oil, which isn't even vegetables. Our canola oil, our highly processed rapeseed oil, all of the Crisco, all of that incredibly inflammatory. The shelf-stable hydrogenated oil is very inflammatory. Artificial food additives or ingredients that aren't real food. This would be food colors, food dyes, emulsifiers, gums, artificial sugars. These are all inflammatory. The 4th category, for some people, not all, but for some, this has to do with the gut lining and microbiome. Gluten and dairy, there are many people that do have an inflammatory response to gluten and dairy. I'll put a caveat, commercially produced, genetically modified gluten and dairy especially. The 5th category is alcohol. At any dose, alcohol is inflammatory. The higher, the more we drink, the more inflammatory it is. The 6th category would be individual food allergies and sensitivities. So sometimes we individually have a food. Let's say if you're allergic to, nuts, you may have a food sensitivity to nightshades or something, then when you individually, those foods may not be generally inflammatory for the population, but many of us, due to gut issues, have individual food sensitivities and tolerances. So those are the 5 foods that increase in added sugars, artificial, highly processed oils, shelf-stable oils, artificial ingredients, gluten and dairy, alcohol, and individual allergies and sensitivities. Now, what is not inflammatory then, generally, is whole foods, not processed foods. Because the majority of these things, the added sugars, the artificial colors, the artificial dyes, the highly processed oils, are all found in processed foods. So when we're going to the store and we're getting cans, boxed, pre-made, pre-packaged, that's been made in a lab, a food production lab, and there's a lot of preservatives and additives. The more that there are, the more inflammatory it is. So migrating your diet towards more of a whole food diet is the single best thing you can do for nutrition. Moving away from ultra-processed food to more whole foods and more of a minimally processed state. You're going to have higher nutrition value, a lower toxicity burden. You're going to get more out of your food because your body's going to get more bang for the buck from a calorie standpoint. Specifically anti-inflammatory foods, there's a lot of spices and herbs that are very anti-inflammatory. Ginger is incredibly anti-inflammatory.
And I use spices all the
Ginger
time.
is good. Turmeric is incredibly anti-inflammatory. Oregano and thyme are very helpful. Omega-3, omega-9 fatty acids are very anti-inflammatory. So thinking about wild-caught fish, avocados, olives, hemp seed, chia seed, flaxseed, walnuts, almonds, all of your omega-3s and omega-9s are very anti-inflammatory. If you're going to do, citrus can also be anti-inflammatory as well. So there's, and then also like berries are also, because mangoes are fine, yeah. Mangoes are great. So antioxidant-rich foods are going to be very anti-inflammatory. Deeply pigmented berries are examples of that. So moving from more to just whole foods. Now, one more thing I'll share, and this could just be a thought for any of you. If you want to make diet changes, making diet changes can be hard. It can be intimidating. We all are used to buying the foods we're used to buying. And so sometimes we learn information, we're like, oh my goodness, I got to throw everything away in my pantry. Like, what can I eat? That's not practical, right? So we want to make sustainable changes. And so this is where I recommend to patients all the time, let's do this in bite-sized chunks. Think about one meal of the day. Let's think about breakfast. We're only going to think about changing breakfast for the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're not even going to judge ourselves, condemn ourselves, or think about changing lunch and dinner right now. We're going to focus on breakfast. We're going to get 4, 5, 6 healthy options rotated in breakfast. And after 2, 3, 4 weeks, those are now habitual. I've gotten used to doing some preparation. That's becoming a little bit more routine. Breakfast is less stressful. So now I'm going to take the next month and I'm going to think about lunch. And I'm going to start thinking about, let's get 4, 5, 6 healthy options for lunch. And we're not going to judge ourselves and condemn ourselves because the foods that have been made available to us or the foods that we know how to eat or the foods to which we've developed, a preference are, maybe not the healthiest. We're going to say, I'm moving in a direction towards health. I'm going to start making practical, sustainable changes because it's overwhelming. Sometimes, I hear this a lot because I do health lectures. They're like, oh my goodness, I can't eat anything. I got to throw everything away. Well, and some people can do that. Some people are able to flip on a dime, but the average person can't do that, right? So it's about making more informed choices as we're shopping from here forward, and then just changing, one meal at a time. That's just the way about it.
That's a great idea. Great idea.
So, maybe right, it's time for one or two more.
Sure, we can do that, absolutely.
All right. Oh, yeah, we have one here. Okay.
Sure, I'm happy to answer your question.
What is the best digestive enzyme to take? Because I have a lot of information.
Yeah, so there's several good brands. There's several supplement companies I use. I wouldn't say that there's one that's superior to others. I would say, looking from an ingredient standpoint, you want to get one that will have both hydrochloric acid, so betaine HCl, in addition to pancreatic enzymes, which will be your amylase, lipase, protease. I could give you a couple of actual product recommendations that I use. So Ortho Digestizyme is one I use by Orthomolecular Labs. There's one called Similase by Integrative Therapeutics. These are supplement companies. Similase is a really good one. I love Ortho Digestizyme. There's also Digestizymes by Designs for Health. Those are the three that I personally use the most with patients. They're just a really nice blend. A lot of this is just, for GI health. I'm not so. There's a lot that can be done for GI health. One of the things that I do with patients a lot is comprehensive gut analysis through stool testing, where you do a collection, you map out the microbiome, the good species, the bad species, the enzymes, the digestion, the membrane markers, all of that. And you look to see where is the dysfunction in the gut. And then you can write a tailored plan to show exactly what do we need to rebuild. For some people, it is an enzymatic deficiency or an absorption problem. For sometimes it's not. So that's more of a functional medicine approach to really very detailed assessment of the gut health to know. But as far as brands, say Ortho Digestizyme or Similase would be some of my top brands, I would say, if that's helpful. Yeah. Hopefully this is informative. Hopeful.
What about colostrum? But I noticed I'm taking colostrum.
Colostrum has a lot of benefits.
It seemed like if I had an allergy or anything, when I took the colostrum.
Yeah, it's actually very good for calming down the overreactive immune system. That's one of its many benefits, yes. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Oh, we got one over here in the corner. Yes. I do, yes. I do telehealth visits with people all over Eastern and North Carolina, Virginia. Yeah, you can. Yeah, my clinic is called Reboot Functional Healthcare. So it's, It's been a pleasure to speak with you all today. I hope that this has been informative. Perhaps we'll do another one of these in the future, and we can talk about more and more topics.
Thank you, Ryan, for coming out. We really appreciate it.